Tanya for the 4th of Shevat is in Perek Yutes, chapter 19. It's on Daf Chof Hei Amud Aleph. The number at the bottom of the page is 82. The Alter Rebbe is defining and describing holiness, and says that holiness is only that which comes from Chachma, which is called the supreme holiness, Kodesh HaElyon, because it is bottled completely to the godliness, to God, that is clothed and present within it. Whereas unholiness seeks its own existence and does what it does for its own benefit, for its own sake, and that is the opposite of holiness, that is Klippa. In the Jew, the level of Chachma in his neshama makes him cleave to God on a level that is higher even than intelligence and than the rational mind, and that's what produces in the Jew this unique Mesiras Nefesh of giving himself away to God, not as a decision or as a choice, not as a preference, not out of conviction that it is better to have Mesiras Nefesh than not to, but rather the Mesiras Nefesh comes almost involuntarily, because a Jew can't be any other way. The Jew in whom this love is not revealed, the Jew who is sinful, it is because the godly soul is in exile within the animal soul, and the animal soul conceals the godly soul's love and produces this insanity of going against your own nature, going against the truth of your existence, which is Kedusha and Bittul. On the other hand, this Mesiras Nefesh is always available to the Jew, even to the most sinful Jew. So this, the Alter Rebbe explains in today's Shir, which begins on Daf Chof Hei Amud Aleph, 6 lines from the top. Elo golus hazeh lebechinas chachma. However, this exile, this concealment, where the animal soul conceals, the klipa conceals the chachma of the godly soul, einei elo lebechina hamispashetes mimena benefesh kula lahachiyesa. The animal soul can conceal only that part of the chachma, of the godly soul, that spreads throughout the nefesh to give life to all the other parts of the nefesh, to its seichel, to its midas, and so on. Aval sheidish ve'ikesh bechinas chachma, but the source and the essence, the core of the chachma, sheben nefesh holikis, which is in the godly soul, hu b'meichin, is in the mind, in the brain, ve'ena mislabeshes belevush sak, the klipa, and it is not clothed and not concealed by this thick garment, the sackcloth of klipa, shebelev b'chol hasmoli b'bechinas golus mamish, which is in the left side of the heart, in a literal exile. In other words, that part of the chachma, that part of the neshama, that is in the left side of the heart, in the klipa, it is truly in golus, but the part of the chachma itself, the core of the chachma, that is in the mind, that is not in klipa, it is not in golus, which means that part of the chachma that spreads to the rest of the nefesh, meaning the rational thinking of the nefesh, the emotions of the nefesh, those parts are in exile within klipa, and therefore he is a sinful person, he's a wicked person, because his mind doesn't understand godliness, his heart doesn't warm to godliness, because his intelligence and his emotions are in exile within klipa, and that's why he sins. But the chachma itself, which is higher than the emotions of the heart, higher than the place of the animal soul, it is in the mind. In the mind, the godly soul is not in exile. Rak shehi bebechinas shina b'rishoyim. However, it is as if it were asleep in the sinful Jew, ve'eina peyeles pu'ulosa bohem, and it doesn't bear any influence in the wicked, sinful Jew. It doesn't have the effect it is meant to have. Kol zman she'asukin b'daitam u'binosam b'tayvus olam. Even in the mind, the sinful person doesn't recognize and doesn't sense godliness, but that's because the mind is preoccupied. And therefore, the godly soul and the chachma of the godly soul in the mind is as if it is asleep. It doesn't have the effect that it's supposed to have. Just like when a person is asleep, he doesn't function the way he's supposed to function. However, when it comes to the test, when it comes to a test of faith, the faith is deeper and rooted in a higher and deeper place within the soul. And it touches, it reaches the soul itself. And in the soul itself it reaches the level of chachma within the soul. Then the neshama wakes up from its sleep, and then it does have the proper effect. It does produce the proper behavior with the strength of God that is clothed within it. Again, the Mesiras Nefesh comes not from the virtue of the individual. It doesn't come from the strength of the individual. It comes from the strength of the reality of God who is present within them. So this is how the Mesiras Nefesh takes place. In the heart, the love for God is completely in exile, completely locked away, imprisoned. In the mind, the godliness is like it's asleep, because the mind of the sinful Jew is preoccupied with the pursuits of physical pleasures or satisfactions. But when emunah is touched, when the emunah is aroused by being challenged or threatened, the emunah is higher than the intelligence. So that even though the person's intelligence is preoccupied with narishkeit, but that doesn't affect his emunah, because the emunah is higher than intelligence. And when the emunah is aroused, then the Jew functions not on his own strength. He doesn't function by virtue of his own talents or his own greatness. He begins to function in accordance to God who is present in him. God motivates him. God moves him. It's as if he doesn't have any choice in the matter at all. God is there, and God is making him behave. We find this written. It says, "Vayikatz ki yashon havaya," that God woke up as if from sleep. What does it mean, God woke up? It means that when the godliness in the soul, which is the emunah in the soul, is aroused, then it wakes up the rest of the system. It wakes up the mind and the heart, and he acts and behaves in a godly fashion. He passes the test and doesn't give in because of the emunah that he has for God, that is not dependent on any rational, logical reasoning at all. And he is stronger, he overcomes the klipa, which is the desire of physical pleasures, both permissible and prohibited, shehurgal bahem, in which he has already become habituated. V'limmes bahem, here suddenly he despises them, and he chooses God as his portion, as his lot. He gives his soul away to God, al kedushas shmei, not for his own benefit, but for the sanctification of God's name. And it's pointed out that when the lowest of the low, the sinful Jew, has Mesiras Nefesh, the Mesiras Nefesh comes from a place bigger and greater than himself. It comes from God who is present in his neshama. And therefore, even as he's giving up his life for God, even as he chooses to die in order to sanctify God's name, even then he is the lowest of the low. And therefore it is possible that a person should be willing and ready to give up his life, and actually does. He gives up his life in order to sanctify God's name, and somehow in the end he survives. When he survives, it is possible that he will go back to the original behavior of being the lowest of the low, because internally he hasn't changed at all. Mesiras Nefesh doesn't come as an internal process. The Mesiras Nefesh in the Jew is not a change of heart. It is not a change of mind. It is the expression of that part of the neshama that has until now been dormant. And that part of the neshama will always be holy. That part of the neshama will always be batel. But it doesn't necessarily bring about a bittul in the other parts of the neshama. The af ki ha-klipa is gavru olav kol yomov, and although the klipa has always been stronger than him all his life, v'lo yachol lahem, and he's been unable to shake them off. He's been unable to deny those desires, k'may merazal, as the Gemara says, harishoyim heim bereshus libam, the sinful belong to their heart. They are controlled by their heart and are incapable of controlling their heart. So although he has spent all his life, and therefore this is his nature and this is his condition, that he cannot say no to his desires, but when it comes to a test of his faith in the oneness of God, this faith is implanted in the holy heights of the neshama, which is the level of chachma within the godly soul, and in this chachma God is present, God is clothed in that chachma. So when that is aroused, then all the klipa becomes null and void. And it's as if they never were. And that's because of God's presence. Kidduchsiv, as it says, Kol hagoyim ka'ayin negdei. All the goyim are as nothing opposite him in his presence. Uchsiv ki hine evecha Hashem, ki hine evecha yevedu v'yispardu. The pasuk says, your enemies, God, will be scattered and will perish, which is another way of describing the removal of the klipa in the presence of God. Uchsiv, it also says, that just as wax melts before fire, so will the wicked be perished, will be lost. Uchsiv, and it says, Harim kadeinag namasu, that the hills will melt like wax, referring to the arrogant klipa that rises like a mountain, like a hill, that too will melt. All of this indicates and shows how when the emunah is revealed, then all the various levels of klipa, not only the lack of emunah, that would be much simpler. That wouldn't be so impressive. Obviously, when you arouse the faith that one has in God, that completely removes the klipa, which was the lack of faith, the lack of this emunah. But what actually happens is that when the emunah is aroused, all the klipa is removed. The klipa that concealed the mind, and the klipa that concealed the heart, and the klipa that affected the behavior. So it's on all levels, the klipa is removed. This godliness that is present in the chachma of the soul, its strength is so great, it is so powerful, that it can displace and banish all the klipa, all the unholiness, so that they can't touch him, they can't reach him, even in his garments. The Alter Rebbe is leading up to an answer to a question that he posed in the earlier chapter, previous chapter. And that is, we know that we inherit a love for God from the patriarchs, and it is because of this love for God that we are constantly ready to have Mesiras Nefesh, rather than sever our relationship with God. But where does this also contain fear? Because the Alter Rebbe is saying that this emunah makes the mitzvahs that a Jew does into an avodah, so that even a Jew who doesn't understand godliness can still serve God through his emunah. And it's as good, it too is love and fear to give wings to the mitzvah that it should be able to rise. And in order to have wings, the mitzvah has to be performed not only out of love, but also out of fear. So where is the fear in this inheritance that we receive from our forefathers, in this love? So he explains that this emunah that is revealed, that comes from the power of the presence of God within the neshama, it is so strong that it displaces all the unholiness to where it can't even affect the sinful person's garments. Shehem, machshava dibur u'maisa shel emunas Hashem echad, which means the thought, speech, and deed of the faith. In the neshama, he is now experiencing emunah in the oneness of God. But how does that express itself in his thinking and speaking and doing? Dahainu lamed b'nisoyin, which means that he will refuse to give in to the idolatry. Limser nafshe, and he would give away his life, afilu shalelases rak ezem maise levad neged emunas Hashem echad, rather than do a single act that goes against the emunah that he has in the oneness of God. The act itself is meaningless because he believes in God, his emunah in God is aroused and it is strong, but he will do, or he's asked to do, a meaningless act, a single act that implies a lack of emunah. As for example, if he is told to bow to an idol, even though he doesn't believe in it at all in his heart. So he's not being asked to believe the Avodah Zarah, he is being asked to bow to it as a meaningless, empty gesture. Merely an act. But this is an act that could imply a lack of faith, and could in some way weaken his faith. And for that alone he is willing to die. He is incapable of doing it, even if it means dying. So we see how the emunah has affected not only the faith of in his neshama, it has also affected his actions, that they too cannot be inconsistent with his faith. And also he will refuse to speak out, to state, even though he doesn't mean it and even though he doesn't believe it, but to state falsely that he believes in the idol, or that he doesn't believe in God. Even mere lip service he wouldn't give it. Even though what he says is not what he means. His heart is complete and whole in its faith in God, and he's asked merely to say that he doesn't believe, and even that he can't do. And this, the refusal to do anything that might imply an absence of faith, that might weaken his faith, this is called fear. Which is included, which is contained within the love, this love that is a natural love in the soul of every Jew, part of that love is the fear of the loss of love, the fear of being separated from that love. And so the fear comes as the flip side, as the accompaniment of every love. There's a certain amount of fear. and this is expressed in the refusal to bow even though it's an empty act, or to say he doesn't believe even though it's empty words, because he's afraid of the effect that might have on his faith. So this love, shechefza v'retzeina b'tiva l'davik b'sharsho mekeda ein seif baruch hu, whose desire and will, by its very nature, is to cleave to God, which is the source and the root of the neshama, shemepnei ava zu v'ratzin zeh, and it is because of this love and this will, the will for godliness, he yarei umefachedes b'tiva minegeya b'ktzei tumas aved zarah chas v'shalom. This is what produces also a fear and a trembling by nature. Again, not a rational conclusion or decision, but rather by its very nature, it is afraid, the neshama is afraid to touch even the edge of tuma of Avodah Zarah. He doesn't speak about the sin of the Avodah Zarah, because what the person is feeling, being the lowest of the low, what is not a repulsion to sin. He's accustomed to sin. And even now, when his emunah is aroused, his emunah is intact, and therefore he doesn't see it as a sin to bow to the idol, although he would be judged as a sinner, because the court can only judge by what it sees, and can't know what the person is believing or not believing in his heart of hearts. But he knows that being that he does not believe in the idol, he is willing to die for his faith in God. So what bowing to the idol will produce is not so much a sin as a tumah, an unholiness. And even the edge of that unholiness, he is so afraid to touch that he can't do it even at the cost of his life. Shehi neged emunas Hashem echad, this tumah that goes against the faith in one God, even though it's only an act that implies an absence of faith, afilu b'levushehu hachitzeinim, even though it's only in its external garments, shehem dibrei maaseh b'li emuna b'lev klal. Although the act is only an act, or only a word, lip service, without any faith in the idol at all, even so, he is afraid to touch it. He can't touch it by his very nature, and therefore has no choice, and comes to Mesiras Nefesh. In the Hayom Yom for the 4th of Shevat, for Dalet Shevat, the Rebbe writes that Mitzrayim comes from the word Meitzar Ugvul. It means limitations and restrictions. Golus Mitzrayim, being exiled in Mitzrayim, in its spiritual sense, is when the animal soul restricts and conceals the godly soul, to the point where the godly soul is so constricted that it becomes small and hidden. Coming out of Mitzrayim, the exodus from Mitzrayim, in the spiritual sense, is the removal of these restrictions and these limits. And that means that the intelligence of the mind illuminates into the emotions of the heart and produces there good traits that are expressed in actual deed.